Well, if you'll recall, we left off in Matthew chapter 15 last time, ready for Matthew chapter 16. And hope you've got your questions with you. Lesson 13 in Matthew 16. I know Stephen hasn't been talking a whole lot about this particular part of where we are in the life of Christ. And frankly, I'm not that great at having in my head a good timeline of where certain passages fall in the 3.5 years that Jesus is on the earth. But if you look at the last verse of chapter 15, he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala. At least that's how my New King James renders it. We're still up here in the Sea of Galilee area, and while Matthew calls this area Magdala or Magadan, depending on your translation, Mark calls it Dalmanutha. So apparently we're in this part right here. This is where we left off at the very last part of Matthew. So Jesus is still up here in the area of Galilee. And yet, you may know that people will outline the line of Christ and have his great Galilean ministry, and then there's a period of retirement. We're actually in that period of retirement. In fact, there are 4 withdrawals that Jesus makes during that period of retirement. And we're just about to get to the 4th of those 4 withdrawals. It's not right here at the very beginning of chapter 16, but just a few verses in. So this is where we are on the map, and this is where we are in the timeline of his ministry. We're probably somewhere on the order of 6 months to 9 months away from his crucifixion, at the very least within the last year of his life, if I've got my timeline down correctly. All righty, we start out chapter 16 here with the Pharisees and the Sadducees coming and asking Jesus for a sign. Now, before we go on any further, somebody tell me about the relationship that the Pharisees and the Sadducees usually had with one another. Am I fair to sum that up by saying that they were fast friends? Yeah, that's right. That's almost, but not entirely, unlike what they were. They were pretty well bitter enemies, rival factions, who really had very little to do with each other as much as possible. And yet, what do they seem to find here in Jesus? A common enemy that is a greater threat than this other rival faction with whom they are typically sparring. So they decide they're going to come together and they're going to pose a question to Jesus. And what is the question that they pose to Jesus? Or rather, what is the request that they make of Jesus is a better way of saying it. Yeah, show us a sign. Show us a sign from heaven, it says here. Now, this is not the first time he's received this request. It wasn't the Sadducees who were with the Pharisees back in Matthew chapter 12, but it was the scribes and the Pharisees who came and made the same request back in Matthew chapter 12. And we'll also find that his answer is very similar. What is the answer that he gives when they request this sign?
He said that they had incorrectly interpreted the signs that he'd already sent, and he wasn't going to send anyone. They could look at those signs.
Yeah, that's the long and the short. I mean, before he gives his final answer, he says, look, you guys can look at the weather. You can look at the sky, and you can figure out what the weather's going to do. And if I can insert a little commentary here, I think what he's getting at is you've got the Son of God standing right in front of you, and yet you can't see it. You can interpret what the weather's going to do, but you can't see me standing right in front of you. And so, as Matt says, you didn't pay attention to any of the other signs. And so I'm not going to give you a sign. And this is the second time that he says, I'm going to give you the sign of the prophet Jonah. He even back in Matthew 12 gives a little bit of an explanation as to what he means by that, talking about being in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. But he doesn't even give them that at this time. And it says there at the end of verse 4 there, after he mentions the sign of the prophet Jonah, and he left them and departed. You sort of get the impression that this is a first century mic drop. Sign of the prophet Jonah, I'm done, and he walks away. Well, after that, it says that Well, no, pardon me. We don't. I think maybe Mark gives us an indication that where he ends up. Verse 5 there says that when his disciples had come to when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. And I think Mark gives us an indication that where that other side was. If you recall where we started out was right here in Dalmanutha, and the other side where we end up is Bethsaida here, or at least very, very near to it. So this is apparently the other side here. Well, we have a little problem here. The disciples have forgotten to take bread, and that's going to enter into how they interpret some comments that Jesus makes. He tells them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And what do they think that he is talking to them about when he gives them this very stern warning? Yeah. Oof. Yeah, we forgot to take bread, didn't we? Was that what he was talking about? and how does he go about making that clear, Kevin, as to what he was talking about? Right. Specifically, he reminded them of. Right. Yeah. Guys, I'm not talking about bread here. Didn't you just see what I did? What was the last miracle that we had in chapter 15? It wasn't the 5,000, but it was the 4,000 that Jesus fed. Right. So they've got relatively recent evidence that bread's not really a problem for Jesus if they genuinely need it. Now, I think Kevin makes a good point. Sometimes we throw the disciples under the bus, but we have great benefit of hindsight that they did not have. There is so much to us. I mean, what he just mentioned about the sign of the prophet Jonah, we know exactly what he's talking about when he says that the crucifixion hadn't happened, his 3 days in the earth had not happened, his resurrection had not happened at that point. And so the fact that they are bewildered really shouldn't surprise us. And yet sometimes perhaps we don't give them enough credit here. But then we have so much more information to work with than they did. But then he goes on, of course, to correct them and say, no, not talking about bread here. And so then what is he really talking about? When he says the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, what is he really talking about there? And why is that so important? Why would he want to stress that message to them? Their teaching. Mm-hmm. Right. It just so happens that Cherry and I read Matthew chapter 23, which is Jesus' long excoriation of the scribes and the Pharisees. And one of his critiques of them is that you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and then you turn him into twice as much a son of hell as you yourselves are. In other words, your teaching doesn't save anybody. That is to say, the Pharisees and the Sadducees' teaching doesn't save anybody. So, men, look out. The things that they teach, they're seductive, and you're going to want to go along with them, but it brings death. It does not bring life. So be very careful. Be very careful what you listen to coming out of the Sadducees and the Pharisees' mouths. Now we get it. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
You have to assume that his disciples were listening, apostles were listening to that, were with him, and so it's not like they shouldn't have an understanding, though, of what the Pharisees and Sadducees are trying to do, because they, like you said, and destroy the teaching of God. So that repetitiveness that Stephen has talked about in a recent sermon, taking place right there to help them remember how dangerous these false teachings are.
Right. Good point about the repetition of the teaching here, and reminds me of something I meant to bring out. Look at how we have yet another example of how in the previous chapter, the commoners got it. The commoners saw his miracles and they got it. Now, we could turn over to John and see how that they were a little bit more concerned about the physical than they should be, and there was some room for rebuke there. But still, they got it. They looked at Jesus and they saw a blessing in him. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, the learned, the influential, the frankly sanctimonious ones among the people who are supposed to be the religious authorities, they couldn't see it. So here's just another example of how they can't see it, but the people that Jesus is really trying to reach, the people with the hearts that Jesus can reach, they get it, while the Pharisees and the Sadducees do not. All right, anything else before we move on into the middle portion of the chapter?
Brad,
Yes, sir.
just to add a little balance there as well, even though there would need to be sympathetic with the disciples and not thinking that they, being too harsh on them and not understanding, at the same time, Jesus did expect them to understand.
Mm.
They were using that language, which I think it leads back to what Leonard just said about the repetition, because we need so much repetition. How arrogant of us to think that we don't, because at least they did, with the reminder, understand in verse 12 that they did get it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But how much more do we continually need that? Because Jesus does expect us to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And yet so many times we fall into the same trap of
Yeah.
not understanding.
Yeah, that's good. There is room for balance there. Yes, they should have been able to follow what Jesus was talking about, and with a little bit of mild scolding, they got it. And yet, sometimes we can think, those guys, come on. And as you say, we need the same sort of repetition and reminder ourselves. Well, the next location identifier that we have here is in verse number 13, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi. So here we are, as I said, we started out here in Dalmanutha. We go across the Sea of Galilee, apparently, and again, we learned this from Mark. Matthew is not explicit about this, but apparently we're on this side of the sea here in the area of Bethsaida. And then the next place we have is Caesarea Philippi. So if I have done my presentation correctly here, it's going to slide north. There we go. And so here's Caesarea Philippi up here near Mount Hermon, but we're getting up toward Syria there, north of Israel proper. Again, Jesus withdrawing away from Israel proper during this period of retirement. Well, he asks a question of his disciples, and what question is that? Yeah, who do they say that I am? And what are some of their answers?
John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, prophets.
Yeah. In other words, largely one of the prophets. And they give a couple of examples, Elijah, Jeremiah. We see that Herod is apparently not the only one who thought that he might be John the Baptist resurrected, or perhaps somehow having avoided death in the first place. Don't know exactly. But then he asks them, well, who do you say that I am? And I keep in mind, when he asks, who do these people think that I am, he's going to have a comment after Peter's answer here in just a minute. But just keep that in mind, who people think that Jesus might be, the identity of this stranger who's coming in and healing people. Who might that be? But then he asks the people who have been his closest companions for a good couple of years now, well, who do you say that I am? And then what is Peter's answer at this point? The Christ, the Son of God. Exactly. I mean, we give Peter something of a hard time. Sometimes he's a little impetuous and jumps in and speaks before he thinks. He couldn't have been more right in this case. The Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah that they had been looking for and whose coming they had been awaiting. He's finally here. Peter recognizes that. And so notice Notice what Jesus says about how Peter had come to know this. First, he blesses him. Blessed are you, Simon Bar, or son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Now, how could he say that? Why? How is it that flesh and blood, I mean, Jesus, yes, he's divine, but he had donned flesh and blood in order to walk among them. So how is it that flesh and blood had not revealed these things to Peter, but rather the Father in heaven had caused Peter to come to this conclusion? I think you're exactly right. Yeah, in other words, Jesus worked these miracles that he did by the authority of God, by the authority that God granted Jesus to be able to perform these miracles so that it would testify as to who he was. So in other words, it's not that, I think there's another contrast there too. We just had a discussion about the teaching of the Sadducees and Pharisees. Men. Was their teaching, was it any of their teaching that led Peter to this conclusion? Oh no, they did everything that they could to deny that possibility. Oh, he's not casting out demons by the power of God, it's by the power of Beelzebub. So the teaching of man had done everything that it could to lead Peter in the opposite direction. But the things that God allowed Jesus to do through the Spirit, Peter was convinced. He couldn't come to any other conclusion. Now we have a couple of things that, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, that prayer in John 17 is a good one. And yeah, you're right. It hits on a similar point there, if not the very same point. Well, now what we ought to be able to do is read these next few verses and be encouraged by them and then move right along. Unfortunately, there's some doctrine we need to deal with here because these verses suffer a great deal of assault. So let me just read them right quick. After he says that God has revealed, the Father has revealed the identity of Jesus to Peter, he says in verse 18, and I also say to you, I also say that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Does somebody have a slightly different rendering, by the way, of that last verse? I'm reading from the New King James when I read that version there to you. Mm-hmm.
Before those terms.
Right. So the New King James and the King James, as I recall, too, they make it sound a little bit more like, whatever Peter says goes, as if it's Peter's judgment. The New American Standard, I think, gives probably a more accurate sense of what's going on there. What Peter and his fellows are going to teach are things that have already been bound in heaven. And what Peter and his fellows are going to teach are things that have already what they loose, what they allow, those are things that have already been loosed in heaven. In other words, it's not that the apostles are coming along and they are making judgments about what's right and wrong, and God just says, Peter says this is okay, so I guess I'm obligated. No. They are teaching with the authority of Jesus, and when they teach what Jesus teaches, they are teaching what God has either bound or loosed in heaven. I think that's the proper way to understand that. And backing up a little bit, we have this business about, I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Now let's deal with the gates of Hades right quick. This is not, as the King James renders it, the gates of hell, so we're not talking about the realm of eternal punishment, but rather the realm of the dead, the gates of Hades. The grave, you could say, will not prevail against the church that Jesus is going to build. And I think that the way we understand that is that if you are a member of this church, if you are part of Christ's body, then the grave has no ultimate power over you. Of course, we can go to places such as 1 Corinthians 15 to really drive this point home. But he's giving to them, I think, new information. Again, this to us, we've read it so much, and the idea that, well, Jesus grants us life eternal if we'll just be faithful to Him, if we're faithful members of His body, if we're faithful subjects in His kingdom. The fact that that we have no fear of death is so old hat to us. I don't know if we can really appreciate just what kind of news this is. Wait a second. Are you telling me that I have nothing to fear from death? You have nothing to fear from death. If you're a part of this church that I'm going to build on the confession, by the way, I think that's the rock that he's talking about. If you're a part of this church that I'm building on this confession, the Hades has no ultimate power over you. And as I say, we could go to places like 1 Corinthians 15 to really get a sense of what that looks like. And as I say, I think the rock there is the confession. Okay, what do folks, in particular the Roman Catholic Church, make of this verse? Well, they try to make Peter the rock. And look, I'm frankly not equipped to get into the linguistics that much, except to say that apparently Peter's name was something, yes, it was rock, but it was something more like stone. I don't know that it's the idea that it's so small as a pebble, but it's a smaller sort of a rock. Whereas when he says, and on this rock, that's a different word. That's a much larger, a much more foundational, a bedrock sort of a thing. So it would be strange for him to say that you're a stone, but I'm going to build my church on you. No, it's not that Peter's the first pope and that he's going to start this, that Jesus is going to build his church on Peter, but rather that based on the confession, the recognition that Peter was able to come to here, that yes, Jesus of Nazareth is the very Son of God, the Christ of God. That is what he's going to build his church on. Because if Jesus is not, if he's not the very Son of God, if he did not actually walk out of that tomb the third day, raised from the dead, then all of our faith is really in vain. And in fact, the gates of Hades will prevail against us. But if he is the Son of God, those gates of Hades absolutely will not. Now, one more thing. He says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. We will find similar language here in a couple of chapters. In chapter 18, he says the very same thing to all of the disciples. And it's worth noting, I think, that, let's see, this is chapter 18, verse 18. Assuredly, I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, in my New King James, with modern pronouns, those sound to be the very same thing. I think it is worth noting that they are slightly different if you were to read in the American Standard or the King James, one that still preserves the singular second person. What is that? Thee and thou versus the plural second person, ye and you. If we read the passage in the original King James, the American Standard, from chapter 16, it would read something like this: I give to you, singular Peter, I give to you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you, singular Peter, bind on earth will be bound in heaven. But if we go over and read in chapter 18, in verse 18, assuredly I say to you, whatever you, that's a plural you. So it's not just Peter that he's talking to there. He's talking to all of his disciples, or his apostles, I think, to be more technically correct. So it's not just Peter who will be preaching authoritatively in the name of Christ. It is all of his disciples who will be preaching these things that are either bound or loosed in heaven by the authority of God. So something to point out there that doesn't come out in our more modern language. All right, one more thing here. So the very last part of this passage, verse 20, then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Now, why would he say that? Didn't we start off this section of this chapter? Didn't we start that off by recognizing that when Jesus said, "Who do people say that I am?" They didn't really know who he was. They just made guesses. Go ahead, Alan. What's that?
It's not time.
It's not time.
I mean, the people are looking for this Messiah so they can make it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not what the intention is. And Peter's going to run into the roadblock here shortly. Where
Right.
he's going to say, this is, get your mind on God's plan, not yours.
Mm-hmm. Right. So as Alan says, it is not time. we have already seen that there have been plots against Jesus' life, even in Galilee. All right? So, whereas Jesus wants a certain amount of anticipation and excitement and comprehension beginning to dawn on the part of the public, he does not, as Alan says, he does not want those people coming and trying to make him into a king just yet. Likewise, we have seen, as I mentioned, plots against Jesus' life on the part of the scribes and Pharisees. And if they get too stirred up and fearful and driven to some point of desperation, like they think, well, we've got to do something about this guy now, then they may be trying to make an attempt on Jesus' life in a way that God does not want to happen just yet. So there are reasons, even though you would think, well, you'd want to get this message spread far and wide. Jesus wants it to go far and wide, but in a, shall we say, more controlled fashion. He wants the message to get there in time, so that, or in due time, I should say, so that things come together as they are supposed to bring about what God intends to bring about. All right, any questions or comments before we move into verse number 21? All right, verse 21 here. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and raised the third day. So again, piggybacking on what Alan said there, this is just not something that accorded with the disciples, with your everyday Hebrews picture of what the Messiah was going to be. Wait a second, you're going to go to Jerusalem and you're going to be killed? Wait, this is not right. I thought that there was some sort of an eternal kingdom you were going to set up. How can you be killed? And again, we look at Peter's response here in just a moment, and we think, well, how could he think that? Again, we've got 2,000 years of hindsight here. We have all of the information that Peter did not. And so we understand what Jesus was there to do. Peter and his fellow disciples, they still just didn't have that yet. So while Peter steps out of line here, when we read that here in just a moment, I think we have to have a certain amount of sympathy for him. He just didn't have all the information yet. And so what does he say when Jesus says that these things are going to happen to me once I get to Jerusalem? What does Peter take Jesus aside and try to correct him about? Yeah, exactly. Oh, God forbid, this will never happen. This shall not happen to you, Lord. Oh, please, don't think this is going to happen. And Peter's probably thinking that he's going to have some part in making sure that it doesn't happen. Now, what is Jesus' very, shall we say, surprising response to Peter? I mean, you can imagine him having a rebuke for Peter, but this is a little stern, what he says here. Get behind me, Satan. Is that, okay, I know. Maybe we joke with one another on occasion. You're on a diet and somebody offers you some cake and you say, get behind me, Satan. Yeah, okay, have a sort of a fun laugh. But I don't think Jesus was kidding here. I don't think that there was any mirth in this or slack in this rebuke at all. Why would he hit Peter with such a harsh rebuke? I mean, comparing him to Satan himself. Why would he hit him with something like that?
This was the temptation. That's the big one.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big temptation.
Okay. Yeah, I could hear a voice, but I couldn't see a mouth moving. I got you. So that was the big temptation. What do you mean by that?
He came here to live and die for us.
Mm-hmm.
So, that is the one temptation that would ultimately kill everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If he gave up on that one thing, then all was for naught. All of his efforts, all of God's efforts beforehand is all for naught.
Yep. Well said. The way Peter was so right, and perhaps he didn't realize how right he was when he said, "You were the Christ, the Son of God." He didn't realize just how wrong he was in trying to tempt Jesus not to go through with this. Oh, this won't happen to you. I like the way you said that. If Jesus if Jesus isn't killed, the rest of us are. If Jesus doesn't go through with this, then we all die. And it was certainly a temptation, as we'll see when we get closer to the crucifixion, that Jesus is asking the Father, can we do this a different way? Is there any other way that we can? I mean, I'll do it, but if there's some other way, let's try that way instead. And so this is, I mean, you can imagine that Peter's just shocked here, but Jesus is very serious when he looks at anything that just might dissuade him from going through with God's plan for him, the redemption of his entire creation. That is only the influence of Satan that could be prompting Peter to influence him or to try to tempt him in that way. Leonard?
I agree wholeheartedly with that. And in addition, I think is the next statement that Christ makes tells where he's trying to take Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some time that has passed, obviously we don't know how much from when he made that confession to now, because it says from that time Jesus began to show.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever time took place, whether it was hours, days, whatever, it was enough time that Peter lost his focus on who he was talking to. And when Christ was trying to bring him back, it sounds to me like you need to keep your focus in the right place. Yes, we all have these worldly temptations, Peter. But you need to realize that you're not mindful of the things of God right now. You are thinking like the Pharisees and Sadducees that I recently warned you about.
Yeah, that's a good point. That you're not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men. The very Father, the very God who had shown Peter who Jesus really was, that's not where he's getting this information. This information that he's thinking, well, I don't know, Jesus, maybe I don't think that you have to go through something like that. Oh no, that does not come from God. That's a man's thinking. That's the devil's thinking, for that matter. It's not God's. Good point.
It's interesting too, a few verses back, he's the rock that they're going to build on, the message that now. He said something, now he's a stumbling block.
Yeah, that's a good point.
The rock has changed.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the accidental reference there is that what you're laying before me now, I'm not going to build up anything. This is going to be trouble.
Yeah.
And this condition, this mindset that they have right now, this doesn't fix it. Even Jesus' rebuke here doesn't fix it, because you can see the same mentality all through the crucifixion time. They don't understand. They don't know what's going on. And even up until Acts 1:6, are you going to return the kingdom back to Israel now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even as he's leaving, they still don't fully have the grasp.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you didn't hear that, Alan is saying Peter gave us the rock here just a moment ago when he confessed that Jesus was the Christ, but now he's putting a stumbling block in front of Jesus. And this is the first of, I think, 3 or 4 times that Jesus is going to try to warn his disciples about what's going to happen when they finally get to Jerusalem. In fact, we're going to have another one pretty quickly here in the next chapter, as I recall, after they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. So there are going to be a few times where he tries to prepare them, tries to get them to focus and say, look, I don't know what you think is going to happen when we get to Jerusalem, but let me try to give you an idea, and it's not what you think. And as Alan said, they just can't get it. I don't want to be too hard on them, because we have so much more information that they did, given the hindsight and the completed word. But it wasn't as if Jesus just left them to wonder and then they finally got surprised. He tried to warn them ahead of time, and they just couldn't fathom it, because the nature of the Messiah did not agree with their understanding of it. Yes, sir.
You know, when you think about Jesus being the human that God had intended,
Mm-hmm.
and we understand that that's what that's our standard.
Mhm.
And I think maybe some of this where he's upgrading them is him holding them to that standard.
Mm.
If they were as wholly committed to God as he was, they would have known the law as well as he
Mm.
did. But they were not. We are not. And we all fall short. But I think that's an example of him
Yeah, that's a good point. So if he's trying to hold them to a higher standard and say, look, you should have understood these kind of things, I think we have at least some agreement with that idea in Luke 24, when Jesus is walking with the fellows on the road to Emmaus, and they're wondering about what's been going on. He's got, guys, didn't you read the prophets? They talked all about this. So that's a good point. That's a good point. All right. In the last few minutes that we have here, so Jesus he's trying to soften the blow, as it were, of what's going to happen to him and prepare his disciples for what's going to happen when they get to Jerusalem. But he also says that we have a similar role to play in this. And what is that role? How does he characterize what someone has to do if that person is genuinely going to follow Jesus? Take up what? Yeah, deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. I don't know if he mentioned it. It seems like he mentioned it a lot, and maybe he didn't. Maybe I just happened to remember it. But it seems like this is a point that John Gibson made a number of times. We use this expression, well, this is just the cross that this fella has to bear, as if it's some burden that tends to afflict you more than it does other folks. And this other person, well, there's a different temptation or a different burden that he has to bear. That's not the point that Jesus is making here. Jesus is saying, you need to do the same thing that I'm doing. I am going to, when we get to Jerusalem, at some point, I'm going to have to take up my cross and I'm going to walk to my death. They were familiar with crucifixion and what that looked like. And so he's saying, you're going to have to follow in my footsteps. You're going to have to take up that cross and do exactly as I have done. He's not saying that this is a special burden you have to bear. He's saying you have got to be willing to give up your life. You've got to be willing to walk right out there and be willing to be crucified yourself for me. And we can take that literally in the case of folks like Peter, or we can take it in a more figurative sense in which we have to set aside our preferences, our goals in life and say, no, God's goals have got to be my goals. I've got to set those aside, deny myself, and rather make what Jesus wants. I've got to make his goals my goals. As he says here, whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? That right there, if you will stop and think about it, is a haunting question. What paltry things have you seen people give in exchange for their souls? The devil offered Jesus all of the kingdoms of the world, and there are people who exchange their souls for not even a fraction of that. And of course, I think it's incumbent on each one of us to take honest stock of our lives and ask, okay, what's standing between you and giving everything for Jesus? What's keeping you from genuinely picking up that cross and following Jesus outside the gate to your death after him? What's genuinely standing in your way where you're holding back and you're not quite giving it all? What is that? Whatever it is, it's not worth the exchange. Whatever it is, it's not worth the price of your soul. For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly, I say, there are some of you standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So there's some stern instruction here, and yet at the same time, I think there's a little bit of hope here. Look, the kingdom is going to come. You guys are going to see it. We could get into, I know I touched a little bit on Catholic doctrine and talking about Peter's confession, but we could get into discussion of what people think about whether the kingdom of God has come already, whether Jesus has set up his kingdom, whether he's ruling on a throne right now or not. If what Jesus says is true, that kingdom came within the lifetime of the people he was talking to. In particular, it seems to be the apostles. So he says, there are some of you standing here who will not taste death. Now, I have to admit, if you go over and read in Mark chapter 9, he says that some of you standing here who will not taste death till you see the kingdom of God come with power. And I mentioned John Gibson already. He at least the last time he and I talked about it, he thinks that Jesus might not be talking about the day of Pentecost, which is the first thing that pops to mind when I read this. You people are standing here, you're going to see this happen. He thinks it might be talking about AD 70. In other words, that was sort of the final nail in the coffin of Israel. God, through the Roman army, with power, says, no, this kingdom is no more, and now the only ruler, the only king of God's people is Jesus. I'm not as convinced that that is the interpretation. I still tend to lean more toward the idea that we're probably talking about the day of Pentecost, because that's the day when we're going to see the kingdom really be announced, if you will. Jesus having been made Lord and Christ by God, and so we sort of have the coronation of him, as it were, there in Acts chapter 2. I suppose the only thing that gives me any pause with that interpretation is he says, some of you standing here. Well, as I say, we're less than a year away from when Jesus is crucified, which means that we're less than a year away from that day of Pentecost. And so it stands to reason that probably all of the people he's talking to are still going to be there and be able to see it. But perhaps this is a group that's larger than just the 12 disciples that he's talking to here. All right. I know I didn't leave much time for questions. Any quick questions or comments before we call it quits there at the last bell? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for your attention, especially for putting up with a scrub today. Hope Mr. Bagwell does well, and I'll turn it over to Alan for a closing prayer.